Hi, I'm Brad Dacus. Welcome to Faith and Law. Recently, I was up in Fresno, California, speaking to a large group of women in a Republican event. Now, oftentimes, I will just focus on what we're doing in terms of cases and the law with that kind of an audience. And then in a church, apply the cases to the gospel and share the gospel. But you know what? I decided to share the gospel and my personal testimony at the end of that talk. Do you know why? Because God wants us, I believe, not to hide the gospel and not to hide it in just church services, but to take advantage of the opportunities tactfully, respectfully, to share the good news for such a time as this. Now let's take a look at this trending viral video.
They are trying to brainwash our kids and are mad that we are fighting back. Watch.
Question I'm asking is, what is the expertise that you have and other Moms for Liberty advocates have to decide that a book, an award-winning book like All Boys Aren't Blue, isn't appropriate for students to read? What is your expertise?
What a tragic story of a young man who's
She's the mom.
by his adult
Moms
family
are
members. So you
experts
have
of their children, not the government.
In what context is a strap-on dildo acceptable for public school?
Well, folks, this is very telling because the attitude of MSNBC and CNN and other networks, and even many in public education like the teachers union, is that parents don't know what's best for their children and that they are the experts. Well, their experts are pushing garbage on our children, destroying our children, leading them to make decisions that are causing them to be permanently sterilized and destroying their lives. That's what these experts are doing. The stats don't lie. We need to support parents, and that's why I'm glad we at Pacific Justice Institute do just that. Now, speaking of abortions, something's happening in North Carolina. You see, they passed a law there to protect women from chemical abortion drugs that could be very harmful, very dangerous to women. So they had tougher standards, stricter standards to protect women. However, the federal government said, oh no, not so fast. Our looser standards, that's what need to be applied. You can't provide greater protection for women in North Carolina. Well, a lawsuit was filed, and we at Pacific Justice Institute filed a friend of the court brief in support of that lawsuit. Now, to help talk about that, I'd like to bring onto the program now attorney Emily Mimnaugh, who heads up our office there in Reno, Nevada. Emily, thank you for joining us. So we just filed an amicus brief in this case. What did we argue in this amicus brief?
Hi, Brad. Thank you. Yes, PJI was so excited to join on the brief filed by Advancing American Freedom to argue, in a nutshell, that states have not just the authority, but really the obligation to regulate the medical healthcare industry within its state, which is to say that we know the 10th Amendment reserves the power and authorities to the states that are not expressly delegated to the federal government, what we commonly know as federalism. And it is historically well established that states have the authority, the power to regulate the health and welfare and the medical industry within their states. We know from the Dobbs case, the Supreme Court case that overturned Roe v. Wade in 2022. We know specifically that states have the authority to regulate abortion healthcare, and that states have the ability to impose laws that are designed to protect the health and welfare of its citizens. And the Supreme Court further said that those laws are presumptively valid, presumptively constitutional. And so we know from case law, we know from the Constitution itself, we know from history, context, tradition, all of these reasons that states really do have the authority and I would say the obligation to protect both women and the unborn. And that's precisely what we're seeing in this case, even though, of course, that's being challenged by an abortionist.
So then why did the federal government lower the safety standards despite these known risks?
I think the short answer is because the emphasis is on abortion and not on health and safety of women. And when you prioritize abortion at all costs, the health and safety of women gets, put in second place at best. Now, recall it was in the year 2000 that these chemical abortion drugs were first approved in the United States. Now, when those were approved, they came with a set of procedures, safety measures called REMS, the Risk Evaluation and Mitigation Strategy. So the title should be a clue that there are risks involved with the prescription of these drugs. And so when they were first approved in the year 2000, they were only meant to be prescribed by a medical doctor. They were only meant to be prescribed at up to 7 weeks of pregnancy. They were meant to be prescribed only with 3 in-person visits. Okay, so they knew that there were risks, not just obviously to the unborn child, but to the woman who was taking these drugs. And so there were certain, some at least, safety measures put in place to protect a woman who was going to be prescribed these drugs. So that was in the year 2000. Now, fast forward to the year 2016, the FDA says, well, we're going to make it easier to have abortions, and we're going to just strip away some of these protections. So instead of 7 weeks, we think 10 weeks is probably fine. Instead of 3 in-person visits, we think 1 visit is fine. And here's the kicker: we used to require reporting of all of the serious adverse side effects, impacts of taking these drugs: hemorrhaging, infection, incomplete abortion, partial abortion, no abortion at all, but the woman thinks she's had an abortion. We're not going to require that anymore. Unless it actually kills you, you're not required to report it. So in the year 2016, they actually stopped that reporting. In the year 2021, we saw more of these safety measures lifted. You might say, what safety measures are left? Well, they said, okay, it doesn't need to be a medical doctor who prescribes these drugs. You don't need to have any in-person visits. So now how are you going to confirm how far along a woman is in the pregnancy? How would you know that she's even taking these drugs at the so-called appropriate time at 7 weeks or 10 weeks? She could be 12 weeks long. She could, in good faith, think she was only 7 or 10 weeks long, but in fact, she's actually 12, 13, 14. So you can see that because all of these safety measures have been stripped away, there's an obvious gap in the protection of women. And that is where states like, again, North Carolina have stepped up and said, no, we do not want these drugs blindly delivered to the doors of women. We want some type of protections in place because we do care about the health and safety of women.
So what does this mean for people fighting for the rights of the preborn and mothers across the United States?
This case is tremendously important for advocates for the unborn and for advocates for women's health care, for women's rights. If states are stripped of the power to impose common sense regulations that protect women, that require reasonable procedures be taken before they're given deadly drugs, if that's taken away, what stands between a DIY order online abortion and a teenager who doesn't know how far along she is, who doesn't know her medical history, who doesn't know the right questions even to ask about ectopic pregnancy, probably can't spell ectopic pregnancy? These are really just common sense measures that you would take if you cared about the health and safety of women. Of course, and thankfully, North Carolina does. And we know, again, from Dobbs, from that Supreme Court case that overturned Roe v. Wade, that states do have the proper authority, the proper power to regulate healthcare, including abortion, within their boundaries. And so I am 100% confident that the court is going to get this case correct, that the power is going to be properly restored to the states, and that this case will stand for the proper protection of the unborn and for the proper protection of the health and safety of women. And I am so grateful and so proud that PJI was able to sign and join this brief to have that voice heard.
Emily, thank you for this very important update, and I appreciate the work that you're doing and others to make a difference to protect both the preborn and the mothers. So, folks, the very reason we're even having this discussion today is because we have a crisis in this nation with regard to our values, how we value life, how we value our freedoms, our liberties, etc. Well, we have with us here a special guest who's written a number of books on classical education and traditional values in society. It's Dr. Steve Turley. He's also, by the way, the host of a podcast, Turley Talks. Welcome to the program, Dr. Turley. So, Dr. Turley, how is the re-traditionalization of society affecting the global conservative movement in the West, especially in Europe?
Yeah, That's actually a very good question, and I don't often get it like that. You're making connections already there in the question. They're really awesome. Um, I think retraditionalization is key to understanding how politics today is increasingly defined by a backlash against globalization. So to me, this is absolutely essential to get to understand what's really going on in our world today. Again, a lot of people didn't quite understand that back in 2015 and 2016. The Democrats still don't understand that. But in a nutshell, uh, retraditionalization is redefining the global conservative movement away from an ideological conception of conservatism to a much more identity-based conception of conservatism. This was Sam Huntington's thesis in his Clash of Civilizations thesis back in the early 1990s, that the world was moving away from ideology that dominated the 20th century, and it was instead being recalibrated and reorganized around identity, particularly cultural identity. And what he meant by that was in the 20th century, there were really, if you think about it, there was this kind of Godzilla-like, megalodon-like titanic clash struggle between three great worldwide one-size-fits-all political and economic ideologies. So you have Western liberalism, you had Soviet communism, and you had Nazi fascism. Now, these were all modernist secular ideologies that came out of the 18th century. Modernists claim that scientific rationalism was the one true way of understanding reality. And the idea here in the 18th century was, and gets developed in the 19th, is if you impose scientific rationalism and its unique political and economic outworkings on all people throughout the earth, we could actually bring about universal harmony and peace. So you see that this is a very common trope in thinkers like Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant actually wrote about establishing a League of Nations based on scientific rationalism. You see it in Rousseau. The problem from the get-go is there was not a single political and economic option coming out of modernity. There were more or less three one-size-fits-all universal systems, Western liberalism, Soviet communism, and Nazi fascism. And they started beating each other up in the 20th century. The 20th century was the century of ideology. And in the process, of course, Soviet communism and liberal Western liberalism teamed up and took out Nazi fascism. Then Western liberalism, Soviet communism kind of had a face-off for 40 years. And then after the fall of the Soviet Union, people like Francis Fukuyama from my old alma mater, Johns Hopkins, he came out and said, look, we finally found out the one-size-fits-all political and economic system. It won. It's Western liberalism. And he called it the end of history, famously enough. And around that time in the early 90s, there were few detractors, but one of them was Sam Huntington, who wrote The Clash of Civilizations. And he said, no. You're misinterpreting this. The death of the Soviet Union means he saw it as the death of ideology. So populations become radically skeptical of the meta-narrative claims of modernity itself, going back to the 18th century, that scientific rationalism was a one-size-fits-all political and economic system for all people. And then that's where you start getting the rise of post-modernity. We see that with Francois Lyotard in 1979 in his work, Postmodern Condition. He found Westerners in particular had lost faith in the modernist scientific rationalist meta-narrative and were instead increasingly deferring and going back to culture as the basis for meaning and purpose in life.
So what is driving this rise of nationalism in Europe and America, and how is this affecting conservative American values?
The key connection there, I think, is this notion scholars call post-security politics. So this is very interesting. So the nation state, as it was formulated after the treaties of Westphalia in 1648, the nation state was supposed to guarantee basically three major securities. That's its advantage. That's why we go to and embrace this notion of a nation state. It gives us border security, so that we're safe from invaders and marauders. It gives us economic security so that we have a decent standard of living and decent material conditions. And it gives us cultural security, where those things that provide meaning and purpose to our lives, our religion, our calendar, our literature, our art, our architecture, our music, poetry, you name it. They're all celebrated and revered, so they can work their magic on us, as it were, give us a sense of meaning and purpose. What's happened is, because globalization is this one-size-fits-all political and economic system governed by a managerial elite at the top, what's happened is that social, economic, and political dynamics have basically eroded all three forms of security. So obviously, we're witnessing the collapse of border security. We all feel that very viscerally. In Europe, ironically, it's the problem of legal immigration because of the mass refugee crisis, particularly from 2015. You end up having the EU, we call them the bullies in Brussels in the EU. They started mandating every nation had to have a certain quota of migrants that they took in. Here in the United States, of course, it's illegal immigration, particularly from the southern border. But the key here is that globalization, by its definition, knows no frontiers. It knows no borders. So borders and globalization are mutually exclusive. So borders naturally erase under globalist systems, and that provokes a tremendous sense of border insecurity. When it comes to economic insecurity, globalism imposes what's known as a globalist division of labor, where Western nations have seen over the last 30 years their manufacturing and industrial jobs just absolutely gutted, shipped overseas to the global South so as to maximize the profit margins of transnational corporations. And then finance and capital at the very same time got relocated to our coastal cosmopolitan cities, urban centers, leaving rural communities highly unemployed. This is what set off, if you remember, the Yellow Vest uprising in France. It was, literally a year and a half of nonstop protests, because you had the working class living in rural France who no longer had any jobs where they lived. So they had to commute, a good hour and 20 minutes or so, at least, to Paris or some of the big cities, Nice, what have you, to work, because that's where the jobs were. But the problem is, because of gentrification, because of all of the finance and capital that got reallocated in the urban centers, that drove up the prices. So they couldn't work where they lived, and they couldn't live where there was work, since they were priced out of the market. So they were commuting sometimes 4 hours round trip. And then Macron, in the name of saving the environment, Macron slaps a fuel tax on them, and they explode. You see, that's the economic insecurities that we're seeing all over the place, particularly worked out there in France.
So what challenges do you see for the conservative movement in keeping traditional values alive, especially among the younger, more progressive generations?
Yes, and it is challenging, no question. And we have challenges that a lot of the rest of the world don't, because we're so far ahead in this modernist experiment, whereas India isn't, Russia isn't, for example. So they have a much easier time going back to their traditions and to their religion. There are a lot of challenges. I would say, for me, the biggest problem we face today, when all is said and done, is how to overcome the effective privatization of our faith and our truth claims, our moral claims, in the modern liberal experiment. So this, to me, is perhaps the most pernicious aspect of modern liberalism, the way it has consigned faith and religion to the private sphere. This act alone makes me despise it. The expelling of faith from the public square, and the ability that modern liberalism has effectively, the ability it has had in persuading so many people of faith to accept that expelling into the private sphere, thinking that anything in the public is automatically a theocracy or something akin to that, right? But we could see how effectively the modern world has expelled the church from the public square just by comparing modern urban planning with medieval urban planning, right? I just came back from Europe. I was spent a couple of weeks exploring some of the cities like Barcelona and Valencia and Rome and Nice. We went to Monte Carlo, Monaco. So it was an amazing trip. And of course, you go into any medieval city, what's the most prominent building right at the center of the city? Of course, it is the church. It is the cathedral. And it stands as a monument that Christianity is permanent. That this is a building that is not falling down anytime soon, and therefore testifies to a faith that ain't falling down anytime soon, right? So it's iconic in that sense. Modern urban planning, where's the church? If you can even find it, because half the time it looks like a mall, right? It's right next to pizzerias and dry cleaners. Now, the problem with that is that the public and private, if you study cultural anthropology, find out, and sociology, you find out right away, public and private domains of life operate by very, very different dynamics. Public life is objective, private life is subjective. Public life is obligatory, private life is optional. Public life applies to all, private life applies to only some. Now, think about what happens when you consign the Christian faith, or any faith for that matter, to the private realm. What happens to its truth claims? They die. They fall apart. Why? Because truth is public. It's not private. Truth is objective. It's not subject. Truth is obligatory. It's not optional. Truth applies to all. It doesn't apply to only some. So when you have effectively consigned the church in the mall or next to dry cleaners and pizzerias, you have effectively eroded the church's ability to witness to objective truth. And it's the same for its moral claims. When the church proclaims its distinctive moral vision, like it did in the Greco-Roman world, in the public square, remember, Christians were executed for being treasonous of Caesar. So when they were proclaiming their faith in the public square, the reason why they were executed is they knew that was an objective alternative morality and truth claim to that proclaimed by Caesar. Now we try to proclaim morality, that moral vision, from the confines of a mall or in the places of consumption. We find out very quickly people dismiss it as nothing more than mere private belief that has no effect on their lives whatsoever.
Dr. Turley, thank you for your insight and thank you for joining us. Folks, we at Pacific Justice Institute, we know these battles full well. Right now, as we speak, we have more than 260 cases in active litigation all across the country, coast to coast. We're actively involved in equipping and empowering legislators to pass laws that are protecting religious freedom, parents' rights against the government, the sanctity of life. We're also involved in empowering churches to have their voice heard, especially this November. So if you'd like to be involved in enabling us to do our work and even more, just go to our website, pji.org. P for Pacific, J for Justice, I for Institute.org. And sign up to get our free e-newsletter, The Legal Insider, and also become a part of the team. Become a regular monthly supporter in any amount. It doesn't matter, but become a part of our team at PJI. It really does matter. And we really appreciate you wanting to join us and enabling us to take the next hill, to overcome the next challenge to your and my religious freedoms and basic civil liberties. Now, let's take a look at what the Word of God says about the challenges of the day. Sometimes I hear Christians say, well, I think maybe abortion should be legal, and we really don't know what's inside the mother, if that's really a person. Let's take a look at Job chapter 31, verse 15. It's clear cut. It says, did not he who made me in the womb make them? Did not the same one fashion us in the womb? God is there on ground zero, folks, and enabling us to live, forming us, customizing us as individual persons that he values, he loves, he cherishes, and yes, even died for and rose again from the grave. That's what he values. That's how he values his precious creation, the preborn. The question is, if he values the preborn, his creation, shouldn't we? It only makes sense if you want to be a follower of the Lord and believe in the Bible as the Word of God. Let's take a look at Psalm chapter 82, verse 3 and 4. Now, this deals with our obligation to speak up and not be silent for those who need defense, the preborn, but also children in our public schools. Here's what it says. It says, defend the poor and fatherless, do justice to the afflicted and needy, deliver the poor and needy, free them from the hand of the wicked. I think this applies very clearly to our public schools. They're bringing in all kinds of garbage that is impacting our children, not just in terms of low academic performance and their future careers. Oh no, it's much worse. Public schools are becoming spiritual death camps. They are spiritually killing our children. And many parents don't even know what's going on. So those of us who do know what's going on, we need to do something about it. We at Pacific Justice Institute right now, we're empowering parents with all kinds of resources and enlightening information on our website, pji.org. We're filing lawsuits. We're working with legislators to promote legislation to protect the rights of parents. We need to all be involved, not out of convenience, but out of obedience to what the Word of God commands us to do. So, folks, remember, we're going to have challenges, but among all the challenges, among all the struggles we're facing today, always, always keep the faith.